In the vast, flat lands of Oklahoma, there once stood a farm owned by the Turner family. They had worked that land for generations, back when the soil was rich and the sky seemed endlessly blue. But by the early 1930s, things had started to change, slowly at first, like a whisper carried in the wind. That whisper would soon become a scream no one could ignore. Jacob Turner was a tall man with worn hands and sun-beaten skin. He lived on the farm with his wife, Mabel, their two sons, Henry and Wyatt, and his elderly father, Walter, who everyone called Pop. Life on the plains had never been easy, but the Turners had always managed. Until the rains stopped. It hadn't rained in months, and the ground cracked open like a dry sponge left out in the sun. The wheat fields Jacob had once bragged about now stood lifeless and brittle. They tried praying. They tried new planting techniques. They even tried dancing in the fields as the native tribes had once done. But nothing worked. The sky remained as dry as the land below. Then came the wind. First it was just gusts, then entire storms. The winds would blow so hard they'd strip the topsoil clean off the land, turning the air into a thick brown haze. It got into everything, the bedsheets, the food, even their lungs. Mabel had to wrap damp cloths around the boys' faces just so they could breathe. And even that didn't always help. Jacob watched the sky one morning, sipping from a tin cup of black coffee as the wind picked up again. It wasn't just wind anymore. It was something unnatural, something ominous. Dark clouds rolled across the fields, but they weren't rain clouds. They were dust, mountains of it, moving like silent storms across the plains. They called them black blizzards. Henry, who was only 10, once got caught outside when one rolled in. It was a clear morning, and he'd gone to fetch the hen's eggs. Within minutes, the sky turned black as coal. He screamed as the dust swallowed him whole. Jacob ran outside, blind, arms flailing, calling for his son. When he finally found him, Henry was curled beneath the porch, eyes wide, coughing violently. His hair was gray from the dust. That night, the family barely spoke. Pop sat in his corner chair, staring at the dead fireplace, mumbling about how it wasn't supposed to be this way. Mabel cried silently in the kitchen, wiping her face with the same apron she'd worn since the first drought. Jacob knew what she was thinking. How much longer could they survive this? People started leaving town. Families who'd lived in Oklahoma for generations packed their wagons, their trucks, anything they had. They headed west to California, dreaming of green fields and stable jobs. But not Jacob. His blood was in this land. He refused to abandon it. The government sent men around, part of Roosevelt's new programs. They offered assistance, tried to teach new farming techniques. One man, Mr. Caldwell, wore a pressed suit and shiny shoes, completely out of place in the dusty ruin of the Turner farm. He handed Jacob a brochure about crop rotation and government loans. Jacob took it politely but never read it. One morning Wyatt, who was only 7, woke up wheezing. His face was pale and his eyes were sunken. Mabel panicked. She bundled him up and ran to town, a 6-mile journey through the dust and heat. The town doctor, an older man named Dr. Ellis, examined the boy and looked grim. "It's dust pneumonia," he said. He'd seen too much of it. The fine particles in the air would lodge themselves deep in the lungs, causing infection and inflammation. Dr. Ellis gave Mabel some medicine and strict orders to keep the boy indoors, away from the air. But how could she? Their house, like most homes on the plains, wasn't airtight. Dust came in through the walls, the floorboards, even the keyholes. Back on the farm, Jacob sat at the kitchen table with the medicine bottle in his hand. It was half empty already. They couldn't afford more. Mabel knelt by Wyatt's bedside, reading him stories to distract him from the coughing fits. Henry, who once played with toy tractors and dreamed of being a farmer like his dad, now spent his days silently drawing in the dirt. One night, a storm rolled in that was unlike any they'd seen before. The horizon turned red like fire. Pop looked out the window and whispered, "The devil's riding in tonight." The house shook from the wind. The sky growled with a low, rolling hum. Dust slammed against the windows like angry fists. Jacob nailed blankets over every door and crack he could find, but it didn't matter. By midnight, it was inside again, covering the floor, coating their food, choking the air. They all wore masks, but it was like trying to hold back a river with your hands. Wyatt coughed violently through the night, each sound like a dagger in Mabel's chest. At some point she broke down sobbing. Jacob held her tightly, trying to be strong, even as he felt powerless. In the morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a gray, lifeless world. The chickens were dead. The crops had been completely buried. The barn had collapsed. Wyatt was unconscious, burning with fever. That was the moment Jacob finally gave in. He hitched up their old truck, barely functional, and loaded what little they had left. Mabel wrapped Wyatt in blankets. Henry held his little brother's hand. Even Pop, whose pride had been second only to Jacob's, said nothing as they pulled away from the farm. Dust trailed behind them like a ghost. They joined the line of migrants heading west on Route 66. Everywhere they stopped there were other families just like them. Former landowners, now refugees. Former dreamers, now desperate. They slept in camps or by the roadside. They shared food with strangers and stories with tears in their eyes. In California, things weren't much better. Work was hard to come by, and locals weren't exactly welcoming. Okies, they called them. But at least there was no dust. The air was clean and the soil was fertile. Jacob found work in a peach orchard. Mabel cleaned houses. Henry helped in the fields. Wyatt, after weeks of care, began to recover. One day, Jacob stood outside their small rented shack, staring at the mountains in the distance. They weren't his fields. They never would be. But his family was safe. Alive. He looked at Mabel, who now smiled again, and at Wyatt chasing butterflies, and at Henry who was planting a tomato seed in a tin can. It wasn't the life they had planned, but it was still life. Years later, when the Dust Bowl was long gone and the Great Depression had faded into memory, Jacob returned to Oklahoma. He was an old man now. The farm was no more than a skeleton, rotted wood, broken fences, dust-covered memories. He walked the land slowly, remembering the sounds of laughter, the smell of bread from Mabel's oven, the way Wyatt used to run through the fields. He knelt down and scooped up a handful of soil. It was dry but not as bad as before. He let it slip through his fingers. They called it the Dust Bowl. But to those who lived it, it was something more. It was the silent storm that stole futures, reshaped lives, and tested the strength of every soul who called the plains home. Jacob stood up and looked toward the horizon one last time. Then he turned and walked away, the wind whispering softly behind him, as if finally ready to rest.